Hello and welcome. I'm Chris Clemens, UNC's provost. Can you hear me in the back? We're good. There we go. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to campus, or to the Stone Center if you were already on campus, for UNC's part of this year's Keohane lecture series. We're excited to have novelist, professor, and Conrad Humanities scholar, Professor Brett Ashley Kaplan, join us as this year's Nannerl Keohane Distinguished Visiting Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Duke University. Welcome. Professor Kaplan is in the program in Comparative and World Literature at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. The Keohane Visiting Professorship is a program that the Provost's Office, the university, and our partners at Duke are honored to host as an important thread in the larger tapestry that weaves our academic communities together. The professorship recognizes the remarkable contributions of Nannerl Keohane during her term as president of Duke University, and particularly the unprecedented level of collaboration she and former UNC Chancellor James Measer facilitated between these two great institutions. Beneath a vigorous rivalry, which was fully on display, I'll say, over the weekend, there is a deep and shared bond around advancing academic community and exploring ideas together. The professorship strengthens that bond by bringing exemplary visiting professors to UNC and Duke over a one-year period, inviting them to deliver a lecture series and engage students and faculty around areas of shared interest to both institutions. Tonight's lecture is the second of this year's series of 3 lectures. The award was created in 2004 by then-Chancellor Measer with the support of the late Julian and Josie Robertson, parents of Spencer Robertson, Duke class of 98, and Alex Robertson, UNC class of 01, and the William R. Keenan Jr. Charitable Trust. The birth of that remarkable relationship, the shared commitments of our academic community, and the generous support that underwrites it has made possible a beautiful and tangible manifestation of and testimony to the power of a common commitment to ideas. Great things, and having Dr. Kaplan here is a great thing, require hard work to make possible. I'd like to recognize the efforts of our partners at Duke in bringing this year's professorship to fruition, including Alec Gallimore, Provost of Duke University, for his support of this professorship, Ed Ballison, Vice President for Interdisciplinary Studies, Serena Bazemore, Executive Director of the Duke Center for Jewish Studies. There are also a number of people at UNC who deserve recognition and praise, including Patricia Rosenmeyer, the Director of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies, and the Seymour and Carol Levin Distinguished Term Professor, and George L. Pattison Chair and Professor of Classics. Karen Gajewski, Executive Director of the Center for Jewish Studies, as well as faculty and staff in the Center for Jewish Studies and the Jewish Studies program, which is in our Department of Religious Studies. And also our hardworking team in the Provost's office, including our Executive Vice Provost, Amy Locklear-Hertel, and Ella McBain. And of course, we would like to take a moment to thank and be grateful to and remember Nan Keohane and the Robertson family, and to recognize the contributions of former Chancellor Measer and the Keenan Charitable Trust. Now, we are incredibly grateful to host Professor Kaplan and honored to have her present her talk, Looted Art and the Power of Aesthetics. So I want to thank you for being here, for joining the work of building our two communities. And now I'll introduce Professor Rosenmeyer, who has the honor of introducing our distinguished professor for this evening. And then she will lead the audience through a brief Q&A at the end of the lecture. So please, Professor Rosenmeyer, I will hand it to you.
So part of the wonderful cooperation between UNC and Duke is we can even share the lavalier to talk through. So I'm really delighted, and on behalf of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies, welcome to all of you tonight. And we're really thrilled to host Brett Ashley Kaplan as this year's Keohane Distinguished Visiting Professor. She's also our center's Holocaust study speaker this year. So just a little bit more on Professor Kaplan. She received her Ph.D. from the Rhetoric Department at the University of California, Berkeley in 2002. And she's now, as Provost Clemens said, the professor and Conrad Humanities Scholar in the program in Comparative Literature and World Literature at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She also directs the Initiative in Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies. And her research interests are Holocaust art and literature, Jewish American literature, and race and ethnicity in contemporary art. What's so exciting to me about Professor Kaplan is her double identity, which was alluded to before, as both an author and a scholar. So her first scholarly books, one was called Unwanted Beauty, Aesthetic Pleasure in Holocaust Representation. That came out in 2007. The second one, Landscapes of Holocaust Post-Memory, 2011. Both those examine the Holocaust's intersections with art and space. She's also published a book on Jewish anxiety in the novels of Philip Roth. I read that one, I recommend it, and is the editor of Critical Memory Studies, New Approaches, and co-editor of a fascinating forthcoming collection, Bluish, that's BLEWISH, Contemporary Black Jewish Voices, which was the subject of her seminar yesterday at Duke. But more recently, Professor Kaplan has turned to writing fiction, and her first novel, Rare Stuff, was published just last year. It incorporates journal entries, novel excerpts, book reviews, and nuanced environmental commentary into its narrative, and follows a vivid cast of characters which include a photographer documenting interracial couples, a Jewish Melville scholar from Guadeloupe, and best of all, to my mind, Yiddish-speaking whales who are trying to save the planet. Kirkus Reviews called it, quote, a dreamy story with surprising emotional resonance. She's currently at work on a second novel, Vandervelde Downs, about the recovery of Nazi-looted objects found in a Vietnamese refugee center in provincial England. Everything connects with Professor Kaplan. Tonight, Professor Kaplan will present the second of 3 public lectures under the auspices of the Keohane Professorship. Her talk is titled Looted Art and the Power of Aesthetics, and it asks why the genocidal Nazi regime was so obsessed with art, and explores some disturbing connections between beauty and violence. I just want to mention that Professor Kaplan will also moderate tomorrow's Emerging Scholars Zoom talk by our own Morgan Morales, a PhD candidate in the history department, who will speak on, quote, a matter of life and death, Jewish women who chose abortion during the Holocaust. And if you're interested in joining us, you can find details and register on the center's website, jewishstudies.unc.edu. So we are definitely keeping her busy. But now please join me in welcoming our distinguished visitor, Professor Brett Ashley Kaplan.
How is that? Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I do realize that putting together these series of lectures is a huge amount of labor, and I am so grateful to everyone for inviting me and for putting this together. So I'd like to thank Chris Clemens. Thank you so much for introducing me. Ed Ballison, Patricia Rosenmeyer, Amy Hertel, with whom I had a really wonderful conversation today, Karen Gajewski, Laura Lieber, Serena Bazemore, Alec Galmore, and everyone who has worked really, really hard to put these visits together. So I am going to talk a little bit about my novel. All 3 lectures are about the novel that I'm working on. But before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit globally, generally, about what's going on with looted art right now. Wait, I have to point it this way, right? Okay, great. So many of you will be much more familiar with this period of time than I am, but here's an example of an object looted in the year 70 from Rome. This is a very famous menorah. The looting of the Summer Palace has been much in the news lately. The Summer Palace was built in 1709 by the Qing dynasty in Beijing as a grand pleasure palace, of which Victor Hugo said, "All that can be begotten of the imagination of an almost extra-human people is there." In 1860, during the Second Opium War, British and French troops marched in. Several were tortured by the Qing dynasty, and in reprisal, the British and French troops invaded, looted, and burnt to the ground the sumptuous palace, stealing many artworks, including the famous zodiac heads. In 1949, at the founding of the People's Republic of China, the ruins became enormously symbolic. And these zodiac heads are still wandering around the world. Some have been returned, some are still in collections in various museums. And here's an image of the looting. And this is the ruin, and I think it's very important that they decided to keep it as a ruin, and the whole sort of idea of ruins comes into play here. As many of you probably know, Hitler imagined that the ruins of the Third Reich would be as beautiful as the ruins of Rome. And this is one of the zodiac heads. Very recently, on the 25th of January, it was all over the news. Many of you probably saw it. Art News and many other news outlets reported that the Victoria and Albert Museum London agreed to loan, and loan is the key word in that sentence, Asante gold looted from Ghana back to Ghana. These items had been looted in 1873 and 74 during the Anglo-Asante War, and some of the commentary is really quite rich and interesting. And people will say things like, imagine you broke into my house and stole my stuff, and then 100 years later you're like, oh, you can borrow it, right? So the whole question of restitution, these are some examples of the Asante gold that is heading back on loan. And then the subject of today's talk, many of you will be familiar with these images. Getty Images has a huge number of these fascinating images of the monuments men retrieving art looted mainly from Jewish families during the Second World War. This is my favorite image. These paintings were stored all over the place in salt mines and castles and in kind of very unexpected places, this one in a cave. And sometimes looted art is very close to home. So probably many of you recognize at least one of the people in this image. So this is right here. The Auckland Museum did the right thing and restituted a piece. And I'd like to thank you, Karen, for sending me this link, which I hadn't seen before, so thank you so much for sending that to me. And the backstory is that Armand Isaac d'Orville, who lived from 1875 to 1941, was a lawyer and collector. In June of 1942, there was a forced sale of his collection at the Hotel Savoy in Nice. Many of his family were deported to Auschwitz and murdered. And in 2020, the German government returned 3 paintings to his heirs. On January 16th, 2024, Armand Isaac d'Orville's great-nephew, Raphael Foch, who was pictured here, voyaged from France to collect his ancestor's painting, The Studio of Thomas Couture, from the Auckland director, Katie Ziegler, who may or may not be here. Ah, okay. So this is this image. And so these are just some examples. Obviously, there's a much bigger history at play here. So I'm going to now focus on this person, Arno Breker. Probably many of you know him. He was famously called Hitler's favorite sculptor. He lived from 1900 to 1991, and in the novel, he's fictionalized as Claes de Mont, and it served my purposes to, I'm sorry, Arno, to kill him off in 1982 because I needed that for plot points. And so the fictional version lives until 1982, and unlike Arno Breker, the fictional version is part Belgian and part German, again, because I needed that for fictional purposes. So this is a very famous picture of Lee Miller. And has anyone seen this image before? Yeah, okay. So there's that sculpture there. Let's see, can I point? Okay, doesn't matter. Well, anyway, I can't find the laser, but that's okay. So that sculpture there in the corner is an Arno Brecker. So, not only was he Hitler's famous favorite sculptor, but right by Hitler's bathtub, where Lee Miller took a bath in 1945, almost at the exact same moment. She's in Munich in his house with the American army, almost at the exact same moment as Hitler's death in the bunker in Berlin is announced. And there's a new film called Lee, starring Kate Winslet, which has come out in Canada and hopefully will come here. And there's Kate Winslet as Lee. And my chapter, I wrote a chapter on Lee Miller in Landscapes of Holocaust Post-Memory, which in conjunction with the film, Routledge has reissued. So if you'd like to read that chapter, it's now free online. It should be easy enough to Google and find it, or you can just ask me. Okay. So I am now going to turn to the novel that is at the center of all three of my talks. It's in progress, and I was telling Amy earlier today that it's really challenging and slightly nerve-wracking to be presenting work in progress because really the book is not yet done. It's pretty close to being done, but not yet done. But Van der Velde Downs uses a multivocal braided structure to explore what happens when multiple strands of refugeeism and migration interfuse with looted art. The main character, Poppy Solomon, is the daughter of a Kindertransport survivor, Vera, who spent time in a Vietnamese refugee center in provincial England, befriending a mysterious Belgian gentleman who, it turns out, was a Nazi sympathizing art looter. Mai Ledong, a painter who was one of the refugees at the center, offers key testimony as loss, displacement, and trauma arising from the Holocaust and Vietnamese refugees are put into fantastical conjunction through a fictionalized version of Velázquez's stunning, arresting portrait of his slave Juan de Pareja. The fictionalized version of the painting becomes a metaphor for overwriting and displacement as Poppy, with the help of art crime agent Maxwell Johnson, who of course she falls in love with, it's a novel, tries to recover this work looted from her family. It's a portrait of a slave that gets transported back and forth over the Atlantic, fallen in love with and cathected onto by Poppy, Max, and Mai. They each stem from families with complex legacies striated with trauma. Poppy has inherited survivor guilt. Max has a lot to live up to in his aunt, a hero who helped save looted art. Mai struggles with what it means to have been uprooted from Vietnam, knowing she can't go back while making a home in England. And Van der Velde, he's one of the most mixed up art looters you can possibly imagine. So the part I'm going to read for you today, so the novel has multiple different textures and types of material in it. It has memoirs, it has regular old third-person narration as Poppy and Max both fall in love and look for the painting. It has found diaries and reports, and it also has Poppy's MA thesis, which I'm going to read to you now. She was in graduate school at the New School, and then kind of dropped out of graduate school and felt like a failure and started refinishing furniture instead. And so at the start of the novel, she's in her refinishing studio when her grandmother, Lily, calls to tell her that she really needs to come home and help with the lawsuit to recover the painting. So this is her MA thesis, which is entitled The Aesthetic Solution. The aesthetic solution proceeds from a deceptively simple argument initially put forward by French theorists Philippe Lacoue-Lebart and Jean-Luc Nancy, that the final solution was an aesthetic solution. Since the end of the Second World War, debates have raged among historians, survivors, artists, journalists, observers, cultural theorists, and others over how it was possible for brutal and widespread genocide, bless you, to take place in the center of cultured Europe. Fanning out from Germany with its genius composers and brilliant scholars, moving into France with its proud history of Jewish liberation and Enlightenment thought, taking over the Netherlands with its transformative painters, claiming as one of its partners Italy with its compelling operatic marvels, and on and on. There has as yet been no consensus as to why the genocide happened and how it could have been perpetrated in one of the hotbeds of high culture. It is my hope that the aesthetic solution will alter the landscape of our understanding of the reasons for murderous decisions. While much historical work has been undertaken on art in the Third Reich, and while much historical and theoretical work has been done on the reasons for the attempted eradication of the Jews of Europe, there has not yet been a text that takes the connection between aesthetics and genocide as its starting point. I hope that by effectively answering the huge question as to why the Shoah befell us, this project will help us understand the mechanisms undergirding the genocidal drive. We simply cannot, indeed must not, separate the intense devotion on the part of the Nazi regime to art looting from the terrifying genocidal drive. Paul Jaskett, in his excellent study, The Nazi Perpetrator, Post-War German Art and the Politics of the Right, notes that, quote, the strategic use of culture encompassed the selective and instrumental involvement of art, architecture, and art history in specific Nazi policies. Concomitantly, culture's ideological role buttressed the racist and imperial goals through various representational works intentionally, end quote. Jaskett is very clear that there was an intentional employment of art in the racist, genocidal goals of the Nazi regime. As Jost Hernan so succinctly and aptly phrased it, quote, National Socialist art is thus not unproblematically beautiful, not merely devoted to perfect forms and empty content. It is also eminently brutal, an art based on convictions which, when realized, literally left corpses in their wake. End quote. The case of Claes de Monte, wherein a sculptor associated with fascist aesthetics was supported by, and yet counterintuitively also endorsed, surrealist or other leftist artists, indicates that aesthetic realms that we may want to hold distinct because it is ethically cleaner are in fact very much invested in each other. This is another example of aesthetic confusion or a blurring of the lines between political assumptions about fascism and surrealism, respectively. In this project, I used de Monte as a case study to tease out some of the larger, enduring questions of how fascism, aesthetics, and the Holocaust intersect. Claes de Monte, 1900 to 1982, has come to stand in for fascist sculpture par excellence for good reason. His Neo-Grecian cleaned line forms evoke the Olympian and Aryan ideals that were crucial to Nazi aesthetics, but his long post-war life illuminates the complexities of defining Nazi surrealist and Soviet realist aesthetics. I explore both how de Monte's sculptures had an afterlife long after the war, and how the very aesthetic ideals bolstered by his and other Nazis' work contributed to the execution of the Holocaust. Contributed to executions during the Holocaust by significantly enhancing the idealized imaginary of a purified nation and idealized human forms. De Monte, the son of a craftsman, was born in 1900 in Saarbrücken. He studied art from an early age and was much influenced by French artists Charles Despaux and, more germanely, the architect Wilhelm Kreis, whose works were also favored by the Nazi regime. De Monte, whose father was Belgian and mother German, spent some time studying Paris and then, in 1925, traveled to Vietnam and co-founded there the École des Beaux-Arts d'Indochine. Brecker never went to Vietnam, so this is really fictional. He was an avid follower of Nazism and returned in 1933 to help the cause, taking up a lavish studio in Berlin. The sculptor made his great break into the established German art world with the success of his sculptures featured at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Of the Olympic Stadium, de Monte notes that Hitler voyait en cette gigantesque réalisation une confirmation exceptionnelle de sa propre destinée politique. Hitler saw in this gigantic achievement the confirmation of his own political destiny. Indeed, throughout his rich description in Paris, Hitler et moi, Paris, Hitler, and Me. I did not make up that title, and that is actually the title of Brecker's 1970 book. And there they are, Brecker and Hitler. At the opening of the 1936 Olympics, de Monte does not disguise his enthusiasm for fascist spectacle. His prose is littered with adjectives such as resplendissez magnifique tempétueuse, and he notes that on pleurait de joie, Resplendent, magnificent, tempestuous, one cries with joy. As a photograph of Demont and Hitler before the iconic Eiffel Tower indicates, the sculptor was closely aligned with the dictator. I want to show you what some of you will know this, but what some of his typical works, this is quintessential Arno Breker. Here's another one, which is very resonant with the one on the by the bathtub. And this is the Breker Museum near Cologne. As one of the great scholars of aesthetics of fascism, Jonathan Petropoulos notes Demont's early works displayed a tension between modernism and classicism. Surprisingly, Petropoulos also reports that, quote, in 1937, he had one of his early sculptures confiscated as part of the degenerate art purges of the Nazi regime, end quote. By the time he had been established as Hitler's favorite sculptor, as Petropoulos aptly puts it, Demont, quote, joined Speer as a key figure in the articulation of the regime's aesthetic style, end quote. And Hitler, of course, was not alone in finding in Demont the aesthetic embodiment of Nazism. Robert Saltz, who was a member of the ARR that dealt with looted art, declared that Demont's, quote, sculptural works are symbols of the dignity and creative drive that is at the basis of the political idea of National Socialism, end quote. Like Leni Riefenstahl, according to Petropoulos, Demont, quote, maintained that art had nothing to do with politics, end quote. Demont went through denazification and was bitter after the war until his work began to be taken up again by various patrons who were able to divorce his past from his beautifying art. Petropoulos notes that there were protests when, in 1981, 1 year before he died of a heart attack, an exhibit of his work launched in Berlin. Demont resurfaced in a very public way when an exhibition of his work opened to much debate. As Klaus Steck, president of Berlin's Academy of the Arts, argued, quote, it is wrong to recognize an artist who created the physical images of Nazi racist ideology, end quote. Demont's work is now largely written off as fascist art or Nazi art, and this irks the keepers of the Demont Museum, housed in an elaborate castle outside Cologne and owned by his descendants. When, as part of the research for this thesis, I trekked out to the castle, I was greeted graciously by Henri Demont, a grandchild of Cles, who described the elder Demont as an accomplished contemporary master. Henri Demont feels keenly that his grandfather should be recognized in the same way artists such as Chagall are praised. He introduced the artist by reminding me that, quote, Demont was the favorite sculptor of Adolf Hitler, end quote, and then went on to excuse this elite role of one of Hitler's inner circle by arguing that to make pieces on the scale of the great sculptor, one needed state-level funding. He thought it ridiculous that people like me termed Demont a fascist artist and dismissed such claims as foolery. This explains why, months before this uncomfortable visit, when I initially tried to fax to reach the Demont family in order to make an appointment to see the museum, I finally received a reply that stated that all information about Demont is available in a series of books and that these represent, quote, balanced information and not polemical. Yeah, right, end quote. I had made the mistake of stating in my letter that I was working on fascism and aesthetics. So when I arrived without an appointment, the museum was closed and I was initially its sole visitor. Eventually it opened and much later one other person came in. I asked Henri Demont if he received many visitors and he replied that he did not anymore. Demont Jr. finds that his grandfather's, quote, only problem was political. People call him a Nazi artist and other stupid things, end quote. And he spoke a lot about the connection between Salvador Dali and Demont, all while consistently arguing that realism is the best mode of artistic production. End quote. We believe there should be realism in art. And here is Breker, of course, not Demont, sculpting, and this is a perfect example of what he's thinking of when he's thinking of realism. And this is in the garden of the Breker Museum. And this is Dali posing for Breker. When I pointed out that there was perhaps a disconnect between the two aesthetics of Dali and Claes Demont, Henri showed me a reproduction of a Dali painting and argued that there was a realistic element within the surrealist tableau. Demont was also connected to Jean Cocteau, and the latter's signature was written across many of the windows of the castle, making another interesting juxtaposition between the neoclassical Demont sculptures and the diverse work of Cocteau. When I asked why these signatures were there, Henri replied that they had recently had an exhibit in honor of Cocteau. I argue that these very visible signatures Jean Cocteau written ceaselessly across the windows in effect seal off the castle from the slings and arrows of fascist by laying claim to an avant-garde queer artist as a bulwark against the charge. There was thus at Demont's castle an inconsistent approach to the sculptor and his connections with fascist art. On the one hand, the very first fact presented to me was that Demont was Hitler's favorite sculptor. On the other hand, he was then described as having only maintained a relationship with the fascist state in order to receive funding. On the one hand, realism was upheld as the quintessence of good art, but on the other hand, Demont's connections with surrealist artists were foregrounded throughout the museum. Demont himself remained irked by the reaction to his work. Quand la presse ne me négligeait pas, elle me taquait pour des raisons qui demeurent pour moi aujourd'hui encore incompréhensibles. When the press doesn't ignore me, they attack me for reasons that remain incomprehensible to me today. The very concept of realism and the levels of representation of the real in art and literature have always been in flux. A very brief look at how realism was proposed as an antidote to the rise in abstraction in the post-war era can be summed up by turning to Sidney Finkelstein's Realism in Art from 1954. Finkelstein's explicit aim was to counter the, quote, present anti-human and undemocratic trend in American painting, end quote. In other words, to counter abstraction. Realism is, for Finkelstein, quote, not simply art that portrays recognizable people and objects from nature, it awakens people to the beauty of nature and also to the beauty of human beings. Realistic art may be said to reflect the history of its times, end quote. Demont's sculptures certainly reflect the beauty of human beings, but I wonder whether this is ultimately realism, as his fans want to claim, or romanticism. In Finkelstein's definition, realism is not a gritty, harsh look at social injustice, but is rather a lens through which to see beauty. This capacious definition of realism only makes sense in the context of a treatise against abstraction, because one might imagine that it is precisely the ugly, the efforts of labor excised in pastoral landscapes, the struggle of the proletariat, the difficulties of human existence, that a different definition of realism might lead one to expect. Brendan Penville, in Realism in 20th Century Painting, begins by noting that, quote, it is legitimate to doubt that the word realism has a coherent meaning, end quote. Indeed, the word realism is entirely in flux. The real has always been present in art, so this division between the aesthetics of fascist artists like Demont and that of surrealist artists like Dali and Cocteau, both of whom not only befriended but also publicly supported Demont, begins to break down. Demont was quite taken with Dali and produced several versions of busts of the great Spanish artist. He also found an enormous resonance between Dali and Velázquez. So here is, of course, Brecker, not Demont. Quote, what I discovered first in Dali and what struck me is his similarity to Velázquez. From the standpoint of physiognomy, similarities exist which I wanted to make clear in my bust, above all the mouth, the nose, and the mustache. Velázquez wears his normally, while Dali has stylized his into a symbol of himself, which requires much attention and care daily. So here's the moment of Brecker sketching, and here's one of the busts. There are actually many of these busts, and you can buy one online if you'd like, a reproduction. Certainly, they're many thousands of dollars, but they're actually for sale, which I thought was interesting. Okay. And for his part, Dali played with the image of Velázquez, with images painted by Velázquez in a number of his paintings, including this one, The Image Disappears from 1938, The Pearl, and Portrait of Juan de Pareja repairing a string of his violin. So here's where it all gets very meta and confusing, because this is the actual This is Velázquez's actual portrait of Juan de Pareja, which I didn't include in the slides because I talked about it last time and I'll talk about it next time. And this is what Dali does with the idea of Juan de Pareja. And in my novel, the family, Papi's family, are looking for the Velázquez actual portrait of Juan de Pareja, which of course in the novel is called The Portrait of Julio de Cervantes, to make clear and not anger the Met, because the Met has housed Juan de Pareja very happily since 1971. And as far as I know, the provenance is totally squeaky clean and there's no looting at all. So I will explain all of that to the Met before I publish the novel. Okay, so Dali's playing with all of these images. Dali loved to offend people and show off his admiration for Hitler, an admiration which he shared with Dumont. In his published diary, the Spanish surrealist fascist Dali gushed. J'étais fasciné par le dos tendre et doudou d'Hitler, toujours si bien sanglé dans son uniforme. La chair doudou d'Hitler que j'imaginais comme la plus divine chair d'une femme à la peau blanchissime me fascinait. I was fascinated by Hitler's soft, round back, always so tightly encased in his uniform, Hitler's chubby flesh, which I imagined to be like the most opulent feminine flesh with the whitest skin, fascinated me. And I have a full reading of this strange obsession that Dali had with Hitler in my book, Landscapes of Holocaust Post-Memory. It's in the same chapter that's online with Lee Miller. And here we've come full circle, back to the profound importance of aesthetics. The mad aesthetics of Dali's provocative vision, and these sorts of excesses got him into much hot water with the other surrealists, turns on the apparent aesthetic allure of this corpulent flesh, willfully choosing to ignore the genocidal drives behind Hitler's speeches. Like Dali, Cocteau also supported Dumont, but he may have had quite other reasons to do so. For my final example, I am going to now turn to Cocteau. As Ursula Boehmer reminds us, the queer French writer, filmmaker, artist Jean Cocteau, who lived from 1889 to 1963, initially found Dumont's sculptures uninteresting. She cites the following from Cocteau's journal, quote, "Le drame, c'est sa sculpture, elle doit être médiocre." The sculpture is dramatic, it must be mediocre. Nonetheless, Cocteau came out in public to support Dumont's 1942 exhibition at the Orangerie in Paris, and the two were apparently quite close until Cocteau's death in 1963. Catherine Brown argues that Cocteau's support of the, quote, exhibition in Paris in 1942 led to severe reputational damage after the liberation, end quote, but that one must understand this, quote, in the context of the poet's sense of victimization at the hands of collaborationist French writers and journalists, end quote. In other words, Brown contends that precisely because Cocteau had come under attack by the right in France, he rallied support for the fascist sculptor in order to defend himself against homophobic and other anti-left attacks from the Vichyists. This is then interesting to compare with the way in which posthumously the keepers of the Dumont Museum use Cocteau's name, works, image, signature, and association with Dumont in order to ward off the countercharge of fascist artist. Cocteau figures here in another interesting way. From 1941 to 1944 in France, some 1,750 metal monuments were destroyed and transported to Germany for use in armaments production. Kirley Freeman argues that whereas it was widely assumed that the impetus for this incredible destruction was generated by German occupying forces, in contrast, much of the energy for this emanated instead from the Vichy regime. As a testament to how widespread the connection between Dumont and fascist art was, Freeman notes that rumors circulated that, quote, the medal was intended for a monument to National Socialism to be created by, guess who, none other than Hitler's favorite sculptor, Arno Breker, aka Claes Dumont. In concert with the photographer Pierre Jahan, Cocteau published La Mort et les Statues, and this is one of the images from it, a text that chronicles the destruction of these works for deportation to the German war machine. Catherine Brown notes that in La Mort et les Statues, Cocteau invites the viewer to take aesthetic pleasure in scenes of destruction associated with the recent trauma of war. And I think the way in which these ruins, and we're back to this idea of the ruin of these sculptures, is aestheticized in these photographs is really interesting. And I'd like to hear what you all think of them. Okay. arguing that while it is impossible to say that Cocteau could have known the extent of the Vichy regime's agency in the removal of the statues, by laying the blame on the German forces' destruction of them, Cocteau's La Mort et les Statues nevertheless appealed strongly to a post-war sentiment that sought to downplay French complicity with Nazi policies. Brown underscores this by continuing, quote, Cocteau's contribution to La Mort et les Statues can be understood as an important public statement by the poet that stands as an explicit corrective to his earlier support of de Monts, end quote. Despite this corrective, the image of Cocteau as a supporter of de Monts remained and confuses the borders between the aesthetic domains of fascist and avant-garde art. Indeed, one may take these confusions even further and ask about the resonance between de Monts' glorifying sculptures and those of Stalinist propaganda. According to Petropolis, quote, Stalin was so impressed with the works that were shown in the German pavilion at the 1937 World Exhibition in Paris that he expressed an eagerness to engage Brecker/de Monts. Several days, that was the end of the quote. Several days after this fascinating visit to the castle, I trained over to Berlin, to the Soviet War Memorial at Treptower Park. On the sides of the memorial were many plinths echoing the ones I had seen at the Nazi Party rally grounds in Nuremberg and featuring flat reliefs glorifying the soldiers lost while demolishing fascism. And the biggest sculpture there is an image of a Soviet soldier smashing a swastika with a massive sword. What are the differences between this sort of Soviet realism, which is really a kind of romantic glorification, and the realism of de Monts, which longs for a lost Grecian idol? And I don't know if you can see it. I can't figure out this thing, but anyway, the swastika is at the bottom there. It's being smashed by the great Soviet soldier. So I'll end with this, which is a New York Times article from a little more than a year ago, December 13th, 2022. And the title of the article is, For U.S. Museums with Looted Art, the Indiana Jones Era is Over. And the article goes on to describe the ways in which in U.S. museums there was this kind of unabashed, unashamed scrambling to get stuff. And that now there's a push for restitution, and that this era, so the Times claims, is over. Thank you very much.
So the floor is open for questions. Yes.
Thanks, Brett. Really interesting in the way that I mean, it's always confusing. Like, oh, you're speaking in the voice of the novel versus your voice. But I'm wondering if you could bring us to this last slide through the novel. Meaning, the novel seems to me it's about that kind of, or the moment you read us is of course the moment of how beauty is instrumentalized. This is a very different moment in which beauty is stolen and taken in a different way, right? Mm-hmm. So these are not artworks that are produced for, but are rather taken from. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how you're playing with this concept of beauty as something for the Nazi period versus art that is stolen from.
Yes, excellent.
So prepositions.
Thank you so much for that wonderful question. And also I highly recommend Paul's work if you're interested in this topic generally. It's really wonderful work. And I reviewed Paul's Perpetrator Images book many years ago, which was really great. So thank you for that. Yeah, so Poppy, I know, and it is confusing with who's who and what's happening, and I'm sorry for that. But Poppy is extremely interested in the whole idea of why it is that aesthetics became so central to the genocidal project, right? And so she's connecting that with the mania for looting. And as she's trying to get back this looted painting from her family, she's starting to sort of all of these ideas that she's been thinking about in her failed, she's a failed academic, right? In her project that she sort of had to put aside because other reasons she had to go into piano refinishing. So she's sort of trying to figure out, well, how can I make sense of that? She's sure that there's this intense connection between aesthetics and genocide, and then she's seeing from her family's lived experience that all of these works were stolen. And she's also very aware historically, of course, of the mania for looting that characterized the Nazi regime. And so she's really trying to make sense of like, how can I put these things together? How, and as you're saying, beauty itself is stolen, right? How do I understand the ways in which these beautiful objects are stolen again and again and again? And she's also thinking a little bit about the rest of the world. And noticing how, on the one hand, I think it's safe to say that aesthetics was unusually important in terms of the genocidal goals of the Nazi regime, but also that in so many wars, in so many places in the world, it's part of war to steal these beautiful objects, right? And so she's also trying to sort of contextualize that with the whole world. And that articulates, I think, with what the novel is trying to do overall, because there's a lot of kind of crossing over and resonance between the experience of the painter Mai Ledong, who came from Vietnam to this provincial Vietnamese refugee center in 1979, and the experience of Poppy's mother, who came as a 5-year-old on a Kindertransport in 1938 from, she was in Paris, but she was visiting family in Vienna, so came from Vienna to England in 1938 and never looked back and wanted to become English. So those, she's really trying to figure out how those things are all mapping onto each other. Yeah, thanks.
Early history of the looting that's been going on war after war, is there a sense now in the modern rules of warfare that that's now a no-no?
No, unfortunately, there isn't that sense. I wish that I could say absolutely that's a no-no, but unfortunately, in Iraq, many in 2003, many art objects were looted, and so unfortunately, it's still very much part of contemporary warfare. I don't know. Maybe somebody here who's an East European specialist knows if there's been looting in Ukraine. I assume there has. I actually don't know. Does anybody know? There's unfortunately so many wars happening, but yes, it's still very much part of war. I do think it'll be interesting to see how the world unfolds, whether all of these drives toward restitution actually shift that, shift the looting. But unfortunately, it's still very much present.
Okay, so thank you so much for the fascinating talk. And I wanted to ask if you think that this, what you described as the mania for looting, is a part of the same phenomena as what Klaus Teweleit described in Male Fantasies as this male aesthetic fetish that characterized all those male homosocial structures that built the Nazi system in general.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I hadn't thought about the connection with Teweleit. Can you say a little bit more about what prompted the question? Because it sounds like you're suspecting that there is a connection, and I can't quite.
Well, even in the examples you've shown us, you like one of the dominant motives was this perfect male body. So I think that was one of the ideals that those Nazi homosocial structures aspired to. So in this sense, this quest for beauty was not only dominant in what you called the mania for looting, but also in the way those structures were built. So
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. So there's this incredible book, I don't know if you know it, by Nancy Yaida, called Beyond Dreams of Avarice, and it's about this fat, and it is the collection that Goring amassed. And so as you look through it, right, it's not only like nude men, right? I mean, he's just taking everything he can possibly get his hands on. And she spent years and years and years, she was an archivist at the National Gallery in DC, she spent years and years and years tracing every single piece of art that he looted and then collecting them in this catalog. And I've looked through it so many times because I think it's really fascinating to see what all he was interested in grabbing up, right? It would be really cool if it were all naked men, but it isn't. But it's a really interesting idea to like play with how does homosociality play into the way in which the male body is aestheticized and, sort of dreamed up, That's really interesting. Thank you for that question.
Thank you so much. And I wonder when is the time period the MA thesis is written, because I don't want to intervene with any and I mean it's a novel still you're writing because I'm asking this because of the Trapto monument you showed at the end, because this became now a site of a very contested debate because Putin's night wolves are coming there, meeting there, and there's an ongoing fight. It's like every year on certain specific dates they're coming and performing. And there is, and of course, the Berlin public is then demonstrating against it, and then it's always they're on the foot of this monument and around this. So I was just and then this is going on since several years. So again, I don't want to intervene with the novel.
Yeah. No, but that's such a good question. So, okay, so I did a lot of playing around with these dates. There's a lot of things that happened after the time that the novel is set, and the characters, of course, are citing things that are written after the novel is set. And I have in my little author's note, this is a work of fiction and the dates are all wonky, right? So, which is one of the things that's really wonderful about moving into fiction from scholarship is you get to say like, so these dates are all wrong, which I find very wonderful. So the novel is set in 1991. And I chose that date for a number of reasons. One, the whole question of looted art and retribution was really heating up at that point, and the art crime team, the FBI art crime team, was getting really active in terms of working on these restitution cases then. And also, it was important to me that Vera, who is the woman who's a Kindertransport survivor, who went to a reunion of the Kinder in 1989, which was an actual reunion, and Princess Di mentioned it, and there you can see the press. And unfortunately, Vera was very tired after the reunion and sat down at a pub and was blown up by an IRA bomb. And so I had to have, it was a big mapping of getting all of the dates to fit. And I also wanted Van der Velde, who's the Belgian Nazi sympathizing art looter, to be sort of young enough to be active and alive and to be hiding paintings in certain places. So I had to set it significantly earlier than now, because otherwise everybody would be old or dead. Sorry, I feel like that was a very crude answer, but
Thank you so much. This is really fascinating. My question is somewhat related to the previous question, but I was just wondering if you could reflect on the experience of writing a fictional character's MA thesis and what that might have been like for you as a scholar, but also a fiction writer, and how you sort of threaded that line, and how, reading this, how the reader is supposed to sort of react to what she's proposing here. Yeah,
that's such a good question. And I don't know how the reader is supposed to react, right? This text becomes important in the novel because it really reveals the inner workings of Poppy's mind and reveals to Max, who's reading it. So within the diegesis, the reader, you as the reader of the novel, are reading it, but also Max is reading it. And so he's learning about this woman who he's getting interested in, what she was interested in, about 5 years before. So she sort of drops out of graduate school in 1986, and then in the intervening time is working as a piano refinisher. So it's a strange project, and I'm not quite sure how it'll play, and this is the only sort of academic piece of the entire novel. The rest of the novel is not academic, but it was too perfect to put, like, I just felt like, oh yeah, if she's a failed graduate student, why not include her thesis, So, I mean, it's a lot of research that I had already done, and so I was putting together. One question I have is, of course, the name of Arno Brekker is changed to Claes de Mont, but I'm quoting actual scholars who were talking about Brekker. So I have a note, and I did email Jonathan Petropoulos to let him know that, I'm quoting him, he's talking about Brekker, but really I'm Claes de Mont, but he didn't reply yet. So I don't know what he thinks about it, but I think it's okay if I put in the author's note, this is what they're talking about. But yeah, so it's a strange thing, and it's an experiment, and we'll see.
So thank you again for this really fascinating talk.
Adi, hi.
Yeah. And I have to say, I really enjoyed this sort of like combination of a scholarly and novelistic lens through which to look at these questions of aesthetics and Nazism. So it started with like two separate thoughts that I'm hoping that I could group together into one coherent. And I was thinking first of the kind of different purposes that Nazis had when they were looting art. So I don't know, maybe if you want to say a word or two about that. I mean, some of the art was looted because it was considered beautiful and they wanted to keep it for themselves. Some of it was looted to be incorporated into the degenerate art exhibit. Some of it was just sort of like too dangerous, right? For Nazi ideology that needed to be sort of eliminated, and a lot of the art actually sort of got destroyed. And so coming off of this understanding that, this is the kind of practice with which Nazism dealt with art, with aesthetics, right? It's sort of like creating a criteria for what is acceptable, what is the kind of art that we want to see, what is the kind of art that we would rather not exist, right? And then thinking about the sort of like reception of Becker or de Mont's, sort of like troubled reception, right, in our contemporary time. And wondering whether there is a place to sort of see beyond. I'm not sort of like arguing, for his grandson's position and necessarily, but to see beyond that kind of like setting of categories in a way that we are ourselves doing. And I'm also thinking, something that's kind of like very close to my field, Richard Wagner's music, also a favorite of Hitler's, that is getting this kind of like renaissance right now.
Yes,
among, like,
and performed in
thinkers.
Israel,
Yeah,
especially, yeah.
Yeah, I'm also thinking Alex Ross's book Wagnerism that was published in 2020 that kind of like recontextualizes Wagner as this kind of like very queer, very sort of like pro-liberal ideas. Wagner that is not necessarily sort of just married to the fascist side. And I guess I'm asking myself, what distinguishes someone like Wagner from other artists who have been sort of like known to be associated with Hitler? I mean, obviously Wagner was not, contemporary of, but still, how does the spot of fascism sort of like gets removed from some artists and not from others?
Yeah, such a rich and interesting question. So, especially for students, do you guys know about the degenerate art exhibit that she's referring to? Okay, so this was a really important moment, and I think you're right that there's something really interesting about what's happening there. So the Nazi regime felt that the kinds of art that Arno Brekker did was really the only thing that should be the only kind of art that should exist, right? And so they deemed work by a lot of Jewish artists, but also non-Jews, as that there were modern artists, as degenerate. And they put up this exhibit, of degenerate art, and they tried to underscore what the degeneracy looked like by writing things on the walls. And so the exhibit pictures are fascinating because you have these paintings, and then there's all this scrawling on the wall and all of this sort of, really trying to knock down the degenerate art. Now, talk about what has like totally transformed aesthetically in terms of our interpretation. Most of the works that survive the degenerate art are now like, right, the most valued art of our time. People like Otto Dix and Max Beckmann and Chagall and, Kirchner and a whole host of other painters that if you go to any modern art museum, what you're looking at is quote unquote degenerate art. But it's been, of course, completely turned around and understood as now great art, right? And so this is a really interesting moment also of transformation. But in terms of like the rationale for why things were looted, there was, of course, you didn't mention in your long list of things, simple greed, right? I mean, these things were stolen. And, Goering especially is such an interesting figure because he was, wanting all of this stuff for himself, right? And another great impetus for looting was that Hitler had in mind that he was going to build this incredible museum in Linz, which is the provincial town in Austria that he comes from. And it's like sort of silly to think that there would be a great, art museum bigger than anything in Berlin or New York or, anywhere, the biggest museum in the world. He was gathering all of this for this museum. So there were multiple reasons and multiple strands of why this art was looted in addition to plain old greed, right? And some of the degenerate works were actually kept secretly in some of these collections. Not all of the work that was looted was, great masters, right? And so this was also something that Petropoulos and other scholars have brought to light, is that even though these works were meant to be denigrated, some of them were sort of secretly valued, right? And so to this final part of your comment question about how do we transform, or how does an artist who has this association like Wagner transform? I think Wagner is a really interesting case study, right? Because as far as I understand it, there's much greater acceptance, correct me if I'm wrong, of Wagner in Israel, right, than there is. Yeah. Like it's been in the news that, oh, look how interesting. Like Wagner, this anti-Semitic composer, is a favorite among many Israeli audiences, right? And like, what do you do with that? And how do you, yeah. So I don't have the answer, but I think it's really interesting. And how do these, and just to trace like how people get transformed or don't get transformed, right? Like I think somebody like Brecker, I mean, it just seems ridiculous that you could say all of a sudden, oh, he's not a fascist artist anymore because he was quote unquote denazified, right? Like it, I mean, how do you, I don't think you can just put that on, put that away, but maybe I'm not forgiving enough. I don't know.
Sorry. Hi. I was just wondering, I know that recently in the past year, there have still been some pieces of art that have been discovered, Nazi looted pieces, and you had been talking about when you were writing your book, you wanted to set it in a specific time where you could still get the perspectives of people who had lived through these times. And I was just wondering, now that we've kind of entered an era where a lot of survivors are passing away, and it's harder to really get in touch with people who experienced the Holocaust in the years after. I guess my question is like, what responsibility do we have to do with this art that's being found?
Yeah, excellent question. So in the case of the museum here, right, it was the great nephew of the person whose art was looted. And I don't know if you want to say anything about it, but the Auckland Museum decided to give it back, right? And so I do think that museums have a responsibility to restitute art. And I don't know what effect that will have overall on museums, right? So like most museums have vast stores of art that is not on display at any given time. So some of what's restituted can be relatively easily replaced, but it is sort of a loss for the museum. And so it is a complicated question, right? Of sort of, well, so then people don't get to see that piece of art. And in the article about the piece that was restituted here, I think you had said, or someone in the article was saying, students used to gather and look at this particular painting because the painting itself depicted a scene of students, looking at art, right? And so it was like it was a beautiful kind of thing for classes to come and look at this. And now, of course, it's not here anymore. But then again, it shouldn't be here because it was a piece of looted art and, so on and so forth. So it is a very complicated question. I don't think it's simple, And at the university, I taught last year a seminar, graduate seminar on memory and objects. And we looked into the museum that we have. We have two museums at the University of Illinois. We looked at the Spertus collections, and we actually have at the Spertus a Benin bronze. And that was another, I didn't mention it because but that's another big question of these beautiful bronzes that were looted from Nigeria and Benin and are now being restituted. And the students, one of my students pointed out that we had this piece and it hadn't been restituted. So I wrote a letter to the director and said, so we have this piece. And she said, oh, we've gone through the whole restitution process and they don't want this back. Which I thought was really interesting, that like she had done due diligence and tried to give it back. And so that's also another question, of how sometimes people don't want them back, or so, but it really is a thorny ethical question. I don't think it's very clean. I think that they should be restituted, but then that does bring up other questions. So yeah.
I'm asking a lot of you, but I know there are two more questions from the floor.
Yes,
So
of course.
Hi there. In context of people who do want their art back, thinking about like a post-war context, most notably with Klint's portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, why do you think it is so difficult for restitution, both legally and ethically, and why it's been such a struggle to get these pieces back to their rightful owners?
Yeah, such a good question. So there's a really wonderful film, I don't know if anyone has seen it, called Woman in Gold, which is about the Klimt's portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. And it tells the whole story of the complexities of restitution. So in the case of the Klimt painting, Maria Altmann, the niece of Adele Bloch-Bauer, was the rightful heir to the painting and had been, survived the war and was living in Los Angeles and was very reluctant to get pulled into the whole thing, but then did get pulled into the lawsuit, and then it was restituted, and it now lives in the Neue Gallery in New York. Has anyone been there? Yeah, okay, so I love the Neue Gallery. It's an amazing museum. And it stands there. There's many, many, many Klimts at the Neue Gallery, and there it is. And so it is now, it's not in her private salon. She gave it to the Neue Gallery so that everyone could see it. But to answer your question of why it's so complicated for the following reason. So if you think about how laws are made and how laws change, right? So at the time that this art was looted, some of it was just actually stolen. Some of it was bought. But when you buy something from someone who has been or is about to be ghettoized, whose family has been or is about to be ghettoized and murdered, it's not a fair sale, right? So part of the restitution stumbles falls on these legal loops and things that people have gone through because they sold the art, right? And 9 times out of 10, they sold it under enormous duress and for a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the actual value. And the restitution cases, as they, if there's any legal scholars here, please help me out. This is not my field, but as I understand it, once the precedents get made in the legal edifice, then other future cases can draw on those precedents. And so once there are precedents in place that say, okay, this was sold, but it's not, it's not a real sale because it was sold under duress, then that gives credence to other restitution cases that can then go forward. So that's one problem, is that sometimes they were sold. Another problem is that a lot of times the museums don't know the whole provenance. So in other words, somebody's getting it, somebody sells it to someone and somebody sells it to someone, and then eventually it ends up at Christie's or whatever, and then it ends up in a museum. And a lot of times the actual provenance has been, fabricated, right? And so it's the museum, from the museum's point of view, they're like, look, we've got the paperwork, this is a legitimate thing, look, here it is. But then, really it isn't. And so, but that's not on the museum, right? Because the museum got what they thought was a legitimate piece of art. So the whole question of how do you know the provenance? And in my novel, I get to play a lot with this question because fortunately for me, the actual portrait that Velázquez actually painted of Juan de Pareja, like I said, it hangs in the museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and has been there since 1971. But there's very conveniently 100 years in the long history of this painting, which was painted in 1650, during which nobody knows where it was. So I've made up a whole bunch of things about where it might have been. And of course, it was a Jewish merchant in Venice who sold it to such and such and so and so. So, sometimes the provenances, even when there's nothing fishy going on, when a painting is 400 years old, you can't necessarily always trace in whose hands it has been indefinitely.
Hey, one final question.
Thank you so much. As you were sharing your work, it made me think of, the way that you're mixing history and fiction, you're fictionalizing historical characters. It made me think in a lot of the big names of American Jewish fiction from the past 40 years, of Roth, of Nicole Krauss, of Jonathan Cohen as well, Joshua Cohen, excuse me. Perhaps it's too obvious to ask a scholar of Jewish American fiction, are you positioning yourself? Are you pulling on these figures
Totally.
On purpose? But I would love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yes. Thank you so much for that question. I am totally in conversation with, so I wrote a book about Philip Roth, and, I really appreciate the way, there's a lot of problems in writing about Philip Roth. Gender perspective, there's a whole lot of issues, but among the things that I really appreciate in Roth's work is that exactly what you're saying, that play between fiction and reality. So have you read Operation Shylock? Yes. Yeah. So how many people have read Operation Shylock? Just show of hands. Oh, only one. Interesting. Okay. Highly recommend Operation Shylock. It's a deeply crazy, silly novel in which the actual Philip Roth goes to Israel, and who does he meet but Philip Roth, guy pretending to be Philip Roth. And this is also Naomi Klein's new book, which many people have recommended to me, but I haven't yet read. Doppelganger has a whole section on Operation Shylock, because it's this wonderful, fantastical idea, right? That you go to Israel and you're confronted with someone who's claiming to be Philip Roth, who, you get to reflect, bounce back and forth. So the actual Philip Roth is complaining because the actual Philip Roth never won the Nobel Prize. And then the fake Philip Roth is, so they're tossing back and forth. Anyway, it's a very hilarious novel that plays exactly on this difference between truth and fiction. And the very first lines of Operation Shylock are, "This is a confession and it's totally false," or something like that. He's really having a lot of fun. So yes, Roth is a big influence. Nicole Krauss is a huge influence. So I've taught her work many times. And what I really appreciate in Krauss is, first of all, she's just a really beautiful writer, but I really love the way she plays with different voices. So Great House is a huge influence on everything I write, because Great House has several different narratives that keep returning. And similarly, History of Love has multiple different perspectives. So I really like the way she structures her work. So yes, she's a huge influence. And I invited her to University of Illinois, and I got to interview her, and I published the interview in Contemporary Literature. So there's a really long, if you're interested in Krauss, there's a really long interview that I got to do with her. And it was really great just to ask her, very detailed questions about her work. I think she was a little bit surprised at how much detail she's usually asked, so where'd you grow up? And that's not the kind of question that I asked her, but so that was really a highlight for me of my career, to get to interview her. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to invite everyone to the reception right outside. Sorry, I think we have to let our speaker go at this point, but there's a reception outside. You could absolutely ask more questions then. And please join me in thanking our speaker one more time. Thank you so much.